Hello interwebs, and it is finally time for the 2020 Jessie Genders Awards. What would that award even be? The Gendies? Welcome to the Gendies, everybody. The Gendies. Welcome to the Gendies. I guess that's what we're going with. But anyways, now that I've gone down that route, for this video, yes, finally, I am going to be giving you my top 20 movies of 2020, as well as my worst movie of 2020. As you all know, I'm a huge film buff, so I watch a ton of movies. So I'm going to just go through my favorite ones of this year. And this is ostensibly going to be a ranked list, but, you know, it's just kind of what I'm feeling right now. And if you came back to me on a different day, I would probably put these in a slightly different order. But for right now, this is going to be the ranked list. Also, I should mention too, if any of you are at all curious about what these movies were going up against competition-wise, I actually ranked every single movie that I saw this year and reviewed each one of them on my Letterboxd, which I have a link to down below if you're curious about that at all. Otherwise, it's all going to be here on this list. Also, one last thing before I get into the actual list proper, there are a couple of movies that I didn't get a chance to actually watch that I think might have had a chance to make this list, which are hopefully going to be up on the screen right here. So those are some movies that I haven't gotten to see this year, but I want to see. I will get around to seeing and might have made this list, but just given access and time, I haven't had the chance to watch them yet. And finally, one last thing, because I just like talking videos full of way too much information, I'm going to give you some honorable mentions of movies that I really loved this year, but I didn't think made the top 20 for one reason or another. First Cow, a movie that was really lovely, but I thought was a bit too slow-paced for me. Soul, a truly heart-affirming and lovely and absolutely magnificent Pixar film. Borat, subsequent movie film, a hilarious film that I was a bit sad and was still relevant in 2020, in fact, more relevant than the first Borat was. The Infiltrators, a highly unique documentary drama hybrid that showcased some of the problems at the United States border and the incarceration at the borders. The Social Dilemma, a very necessary film about the influence of social media on present-day discourse. Feels Good Man, a truly interesting documentary about the far-right almost co-opting the Pepe the Frog meme and one creator's fight to get it back. Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, a truly wonderful film that will sadly be remembered more for Chadwick Boseman's amazing final performance. Come to Daddy, a brilliant horror comedy for Elijah Wood. Save Yourselves, a hilarious romantic comedy set during an alien invasion of tribbles that I really thought was wonderful but slightly bungled its ending and the final moments. Love and Monsters, a surprisingly unique big-budget horror comedy starring Daniel O'Brien that has way more heart than it deserved to. Freaky, a wonderful horror comedy twist on the Freaky Friday idea that sadly stars Vince Vaughn, who does a fantastic job in the role, but, you know, Vince Vaughn is Vince Vaughn, so take that for what you will. And finally, Blow the Man Down, a really interesting murder mystery that was slightly too slow-paced for me. All right, now with those out of the way, let's get into the top 20. All right, right at the bottom is number 20, Promising Young Woman. Now, I'll be entirely honest with you, Promising Young Woman almost was the number one film on this list, but sadly bungled its ending so badly that it just really frustrated me because it was trying to have its cake and eat it too. And I might actually do a whole video about that movie and how disappointed I was in its final twist in the film. Basically, without spoiling the ending of this movie could have ended one of two ways, and I would have been fine with either of those directions, but the director ultimately wanted to try to do both of them and didn't ultimately pick either of them, and it ultimately just ruins the entire message of the film. So that was really disappointing because up until that literal last minute, I was going to give this my number one spot on this list, and it is well worth watching. Just the last minute of this film frustrates me so hard. But if you ignore the ending, this movie is a devilishly wonderful film. It subverts expectations at almost every single moment. What you expect from this movie is not exactly what you get, but it is a wonderful discussion about women trying to gain power in a world that sadly only values them for their body. Carey Mulligan does a truly fantastic job in so many tense and surprising and absolutely intriguing scenes that honestly shocked me every single time. It also has devilish use of Bo Burnham. This movie is absolutely so fantastic on almost every level and would have been number one if not for quite literally the final minute of the film that just, you got so close and just bungled it at the finish line for me. So great movie. Just be aware that the final minute of the film, just literally the final minute, disappointed me heavily. Number 19, Extraordinary. This movie was a true horror comedy gem. Horror comedy is one of my favorite genres just in general. And I always love horror comedy when they can mix the horror with like truly heartwarming comedy that actually hits me in my heart. And that's what this movie does. This movie follows a supernatural investigator who's kind of down on her luck, who starts to find romance, but then gets tied into a much larger, more dangerous plot by the devilish but slightly incompetent Will Forte in a wonderful turn by Will Forte. It's truly really heartwarming. It's kind of almost like a romantic comedy in a lot of ways, but still has those like horror elements that really, really get you. And it really just it warmed my heart watching this film. And I think Extraordinary is just a truly, truly surprise gem that you wouldn't really think about and you might forget, but ultimately just stuck on this list because I just remember having so much joy with it. Number 18, Another Round. This movie about a group of 4 teachers and friends who decide to start day drinking and do an experiment around day drinking to try and improve their lives is one of the most profound movies that I watched this year. It is simultaneously incredibly hilarious and funny, yet also deeply, deeply sad in that sort of like indie comedy way that sort of indie comedies can get sad, and yet was one of the most life-affirming films I have seen in a long, long time. This movie left me at the end with a true joy in my heart, despite some of the sadness and melancholy that permeates the latter half of the movie. And it's all tied together by a star performance by Mads Mikkelsen. I have never seen Mads Mikkelsen do anything less than superbly. He always brings such humanity and yet weight and gravitas to every role that he's in. And here he just makes me feel for his main character despite all the sort of harder decisions that he goes through. So Another Round, truly a profound experience of a film, and made even more profound by the fact that I learned that the director decided to change the ending of the movie to make it more life-affirming once his daughter convinced him to make this movie and then passed away shortly after filming started. So truly a melancholic joy. Number 17, Hamilton. I was not expecting to love this movie as much as I did. I like musicals. I always like musicals more in the theater setting than I do actually watching them at home. And so when I sat down to watch the, film version of Hamilton, I did not expect to love it as much as I would have liked to have watched it on stage. But this film performance just brought so much energy to it. You could really tell that Lin-Manuel Miranda and all the rest of the cast were just bringing their A game. And while I had heard some of the songs on Hamilton, I did not know how clever, how nuanced, how energetic, how joyous they really were until I saw them actually being performed with the amount of energy that they should be performed with. I listened to the album after I watched the whole movie, and the album just does not have the same level of energy that this film's performance brings, and it is just so wonderful, and it is so amazing. And there's something to be said about the sort of revisionist history of this film around the Founding Fathers, because the Founding Fathers were not fantastic, amazing people. They were slave owners, but there is something to be said for seeing the Founding Fathers in this way with such a very black cast, and saying that people like George Washington can be imagined this way, that we can imagine ourselves into these people's stories even if we are part of marginalized groups. And it was just so affirming in a weird way, even though I'm not a member of the Black community. It was so affirming to sort of see that message being portrayed here, that we can still take inspiration from stories that are not our own, and also discussion about who gets to write our stories and what our stories mean to each other in such a energetic, clever, fun way. So Hamilton was fantastic. Number 16, Run. Run is a surprisingly devilish horror thriller by a director that has easily become one of my directors to watch. The director, Anash Chasti, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, so apologies to him, but his other movie, Searching, with John Cho, is another like truly standout thriller mystery movie that I would also highly recommend, from I believe 2 or 3 years ago. Run is one of those movies that just hits every single note along the way perfectly. It has a few surprises in it, but generally, this is kind of exactly what you expect from the tin. The movie follows a mother, Carey Mulligan, who is incredibly overprotective of her daughter, who is in a wheelchair and has a host of medical problems throughout her entire life. And like I said, there are a few twists and turns, but this movie just does exactly what you want this type of thriller to do perfectly at every single level, right up until the final moment of the movie where you're like, is this the ending? Is this the ending? And then it just pulls it off, and you're like, oh, that is the most satisfying way this movie could have ended. Truly like a pitch perfect thriller that I could not recommend enough. There is something to be said, too, possibly about the representation of the disabled community, which I certainly understand that is kind of an unfortunate trope within horror and thriller genre. But that being said, taken for what it is and on its own terms, I think this is a truly fantastic thriller. Number 15, The Painter and the Thief. The Painter and the Thief is a documentary about a Czech artist who had two of her highly prized paintings stolen. But then, several months later, when the thief is found and brought to court, he cannot remember where he put the paintings. And so the artist starts to befriend the thief, and they form this truly wonderful bond between them. And like I said, this is a documentary. This is a true story. And I don't think I have cried more than at the scene where the Czech artist decides to paint a portrait of the man who stole her painting. And you can tell that when he sees that painting, it is the first time in his life that he has ever seen himself as beautiful. And he breaks down. And to know that this is a true story and that I was watching a real moment filmed with such tenderness, that moment broke me. I don't really have any other words than to say this movie is empathy incarnate, and just hit me so hard to just see two people who should hate each other, should be angry at each other, and yet see each other more profoundly than I think we ever get to really see each other. So many of us get to see each other. So truly a wonderful, wonderful documentary. Number 14, Possessor. This is a movie by Brian Cronenberg, son of David Cronenberg, who is now of Star Trek Discovery fame. But this movie is such a truly, truly unique experience. I could explain what the plot of this movie is to you. It's basically an assassin takes over other people's bodies in order to commit said assassinations. But it is told in such a metaphorical and visual way that it really does a disservice just to describe it by plot alone. Some of the sequences in this movie just manage to metaphorically represent what is happening in such a surprisingly dark, creepy, and yet poetic way that this is one of those few films that I think fully takes true advantage of being a film, of taking advantage of being a visual medium. Truly fantastic. And a fun science fiction movie to boot, but just visually so evocative. Number 13, Feedback. Feedback was a movie I was not expecting to place on this list, but was so surprised when I actually sat down and watched it, because it is another one of those just deeply effective horror thrillers. This movie follows a radio show host, a left-wing radio show host who was recently kidnapped, who is in his studio late at night, and the studio then gets attacked by two people who may have a darker motive than he may eventually realize. Truly a wonderful and deeply well-paced film that managed to be deeply, deeply human as well. I will say that this does come with a heavy trigger warning for discussions of sexual assault and sexual violence. That doesn't happen on screen, but it is vividly described in this movie. And I think that might be tough for some, especially how it frames the empathy that we're supposed to have in that moment. But I ultimately think the movie pulls it off, but it does walk a very, very tight rope that for some people may not work at all. So definitely comes with a heavy trigger warning and just warning in general on that front. But for me, I thought that this movie was a truly engaging and unique thriller that walked that very fine line and eventually pulled it off for me. Number 12, Never, Rarely, Sometimes Never. This movie follows a young woman who gets pregnant while she is still in high school and has to travel to the city in order to get an abortion. And it just basically chronicles the events of this girl going to an abortion clinic and having to get an abortion. That on its face sounds like this is a movie that has a very clear message about what it wants to say, but ultimately this movie just feels like a slice of life. Like an experience that as a trans woman who will never have the ability to get pregnant, it's not something that I have ever had to face or deal with or worry about. So to see it portrayed so genuinely and without judgment of anyone involved, but just portraying it actually made it feel like one of the most political movies I've ever seen in my life. and yet it does so without being preachy, without beating you over the head, but just showing you how hard this is for anyone to go through, and how many loopholes and hoops that they have to jump through, but also the emotional toll of it as well, and how internal that struggle can really be. Just beautifully, beautifully portrayed. And I don't think I've ever seen a movie that is just so naturalistic and yet so targetedly meaningful in what it had to say. So a wonderful gem that I highly encourage everyone to watch. Number 11, Yes, God, Yes. So this is a very different kind of jump from the last movie that I was talking about, but this movie also does deal with sexuality of young women. This movie is a kind of indie comedy, again, that sort of like interesting tonal balance between being kind of melancholic, but also very funny at the same time, about a young woman who goes to a Catholic school and has to go to a Catholic retreat and is dealing with going through puberty and going through finding her sexual desires in a very, very repressive religious environment. It is not as disdainful of religion as I had expected to be. I expected to be like, screw the Catholic Church. And the movie does poke fun at the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church, but it also makes this young girl feel very authentic to being raised in a Catholic environment. As someone who was raised in a Roman Catholic environment, my mom's side, and a Wesleyan church on my dad's side, I definitely have very interesting mixed relationships with church and sexuality and all those things, and also being LGBTQ certainly add its own things onto the mix. So there was a lot in this movie that I recognized as very truthful about going through puberty and sort of doing that in a religious environment. And what I did really like about it is, while I am certainly no fan of the Catholic Church, I did like that the movie didn't overly judge, but just let the girl exist in the world that she existed in, and managed to be very funny as well. So a truly great film, also very short as well. I think it was only an hour and 15 minutes, hour 20 minutes. So just short in and out experience that I was deeply moved by and found hilarious. Number 10, The Trial of the Chicago 7. This is an Aaron Sorkin film with everything that you expect from an Aaron Sorkin film. It is, very didactic. It is overly sappy and heightened and overly verbose and dialogue driven. And honestly, as someone who's a Star Trek fan, that speaks to me very, very heavily. That's why I love Aaron Sorkin. He is basically Star Trek, but for real world stuff. So that is why I truly, truly love this film. I think it spoke so deeply to stuff going on today, but also showing a part of history that I was not aware of. The only thing that I will say about it is that, I wish there were more black characters centered in the film. There is one important black character in the film whose story is probably the most profound in the movie, and I also understand that just by the nature of who this story was following, the trial of the Chicago 7, that's not exactly necessary, but it did just hit me that this story is all about police and police brutality, and it came out right around the Black Lives Matter protest this summer, and so I was just sort of like, oh yeah, that is something that just sort of strikes me, but I know that it's not necessarily the film's fault, but it was just something I was thinking about as I was watching it. But that being said, it's Aaron Sorkin doing more Aaron Sorkin, and you can either be on board for that or not, and I totally get it either way, but for me, Aaron Sorkin just generally works super well for my particular flavor of what I like in a movie or television show. Number 9, Birds of Prey. I'm going to keep this one really, really short because I've already done an entire video on why I love Birds of Prey. So if you want my more detailed thoughts on that, go check this out. Check out the video that I'll link up above or down below. But Birds of Prey is easily going to go down as probably one of my favorite superhero movies of all time. It is a movie that is so unique and fresh and different, and I totally understand it not being for everybody. It also follows a character who I adore. I love, love, love Harley Quinn, and yet it shows me what you can do when you can make a superhero movie both diverse and inclusive, and try to bring as many different voices into the storytelling as possible, both in front of and behind the screen. And for that, I think it just makes one of the most unique superhero films that I've ever had the joy to watch. And like I said, it's not going to be for everybody. It has its own taste that very much fits the flavor of Harley Quinn, but Margot Robbie just, I think, matches that voice so well, and I just adore Birds of Prey. And like I said, I did a whole video on why I love this movie, so I'll leave it there. Number 8, The Wolf of Snow Hollow. I adored this movie. This movie is basically a horror movie version of Fargo. It is so funny, so dry funny and dry humor, and it's just a look at the social dynamics of a small town, but also of masculinity and what it means to try and be sort of meaningful and strong within a small town environment. There's also some like fun investigations. It is also, like I said, incredibly funny. Apparently much more divisive than I would have thought, because I watched this movie with a friend and I adored it. I was almost anticipating putting this nearer the top of this list, but there's just a few other movies that I think beat it, in my opinion. But I adored this movie so much, but my friend hated it with a fiery passion, which I was so shocked by when we finished the film. I was just like, you really hated this movie? And she was like, yeah, this might be my least favorite movie I've ever watched. So apparently very divisive in terms of your taste. But if you like Fargo and you like horror movies, I think this movie just nails that exact tone in a really fun way. And so I highly recommend The Wolf of Snow Hollow. Number 7, Mangrove. So technically this might not be considered a movie. It might be considered a TV show because it's part of the Small Axe series, the anthology television series over on Netflix. But it is a 2-hour film. It is directed by Steve McQueen, who many of you may know directed 12 Years a Slave. And of those 5 films that were part of the Small Axe, Mangrove I think is definitely the best. It is honestly very similar to the Trial of the Chicago 7 in that it is a trial movie about people fighting against police brutality and the injustices done by the government in terms of, siding with the police over minority and marginalized groups. However, the difference between this and the Trial of Chicago 7, besides, Aaron Sorkin's unique brand of voice, is that this movie actually lets something unique happen. It actually lets Black people take center stage in their story, in actually fighting back against the system that oppresses them. Too often in films like this, we often see the white savior or like a white lawyer who, fights for them and helps them. And yeah, he'll let them be involved, but it's usually sort of a white lawyer doing this. This movie just lets Black people be the heroes of their own story. And I really deeply appreciated it for it. And this is also a trial that happened in the United Kingdom, not America, so I was even less aware of it than the Trial of Chicago 7. So just on that level of being something important part of history that I was just not aware of at all, I think was deeply necessary, and again, a very timely message for 2020. Number 6, Scare Me. This movie is going to be another one of those horror movies that is not going to be to everyone's taste. It's either going to work for you or it's going to not work for you. And I also did a whole video on it, so I'll keep this description fairly short. But this is kind of ostensibly an anthology story and an anthology film in that there are several little horror stories told throughout the movie. But all it is Aya Cash, who many people may know from her wonderful turn as on The Boys this season, as well as writer-director Josh Rubin, just sort of in a room telling each other ghost stories in a dark cabin in the woods. And it's all reliant on sound effects and both Josh and Aya's fantastic acting. So brilliant job overall. Like I said, it may not work for everybody, but I think it's just a movie that speaks to the power of campfire stories and the imagination, and also tells a wonderful character story as well with these two characters within this sort of anthology wrapper. So fantastic horror movie. Number 5, The Vast of Night. This is the film debut of Andrew Patterson, and I am not kidding when I say right off this film, I am immediately on board for everything that this director does. This movie is basically sort of a send-up of The Outer Limits and the Twilight Zone style of filmmaking, but it's told with such a unique filmmaking style, and it's such a confident filmmaking style that I was just so enraptured in this film's mood and tone and setting. It made me feel like I was in the 1920s and that sort of very scary paranoia type of time in the United States where things like UFOs attacking and abducting people felt so real and terrifying and scary. It just drew me into that sort of Twilight Zone-y Outer Limits kind of world. And like I said, there are some filmmaking choices in this movie that just I would never have expected a first-time filmmaker to do. There is a moment in this film, just, this is just a filmmaking technique spoiler, where the screen goes black for 2 whole minutes. There's nothing on screen for 2 minutes, just a black screen, and is just telling you the story through this man's voice. And it enthralled me. And that is such a confidence that you so rarely see from filmmakers today. This is a very slow-paced horror film, but one well worth watching. Number 4, Da 5 Bloods. This is a Spike Lee joint. This came out earlier in the year and sadly might be forgotten by the time awards season starts rolling around. But it is also another film where we get to see the wonderful late Chadwick Boseman, and who I think does a fantastic job in a supporting role here, and he well deserves an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor for this role. This is about 5 friends, 5 Vietnam veterans, for 5 men of color who go back to Vietnam in order to find not only their friend's body, but also the gold that was buried near his body as well. Some gold that they found and buried while they were in Vietnam the first time. And it's all about these scars that something like Vietnam leaves on you, and leaves on, marginalized people in specific and the Black community in specific, and what the Vietnam conflict did to those people. And as always with Spike Lee, his voice is just so effervescent all the way through, and is so very, very targeted at today. Even though this movie is essentially about, the scars of the Vietnam War, there's no bones about the fact that this movie is very much about today. And that is just Spike Lee's style from everything that he's done. And most especially ever since Black Klansman, another fantastic film of his that I really loved. So just a great movie. One that I have to rewatch so I can be able to speak more specifically on it. It's been a little bit, but I just remember absolutely adoring this film, especially for Chadwick Boseman's performance, and Spike Lee's just wonderful authoritative voice on it. So highly, highly recommend Da 5 Bloods. Number 3, Wolfwalkers. This animation studio who made Wolfwalkers has made a few films that I have thought have been truly, truly stupendous. Their most recent one, Song of the Sea, I thought was a true, true gem that, in my opinion, I hope won the Best Animated Film that year. I don't remember if Pixar usually gets it. But for my money, I think that Wolfwalkers is actually better than Soul. I think that this animation studio is just so gorgeous. There is beauty in every single frame of this movie. It's like every single frame of this is a true masterpiece of art, and it's just gorgeous to look at. And while the story is not necessarily one to write home about, it kind of hits all the beats that you expect. It is very effectively told, very beautifully told. Tells a bit of folklore and a unique twist on Irish folklore that you never really get to see in animated movies all that much. Typically we have these sort of more Americanized version of these sort of folk tales. And so I really like, this Irish studio telling Irish stories very authentically and just so gorgeously too, that I cannot recommend Wolfwalkers enough. I thought it was a truly, truly gorgeous movie. And for my money, I know a lot of people like Soul, but for me, I think Wolfwalkers might be my animated movie of the year. Number 2, Minari. Minari is a semi-autobiographical movie by Lee Isaac Chung about his youth growing up as a son of a Korean immigrant who moved to Arkansas to try and grow a farm and sort of deal with the hardships that it is with not having a lot of money, being an immigrant, and trying to have your American dream in the world while also trying to raise a family. This was a movie that I did not expect to put on this list at all, let alone so high on this list. It's one of those like indie darling films that everyone talks about, says it's really beautiful, says it's really wonderful, but I watch and it doesn't necessarily hit me as well as it could. That's what happened earlier this year with the movie First Cow. I really liked First Cow, but everyone's saying it's like one of the best movies of the year, and I found it to be a little bit too slow and a little bit too dull for me, despite the clear artistic craft behind it. Minari is different though. Minari is one of those movies that just, I think, nails and lands the feeling of melancholy perfectly. And when a movie nails the tone of melancholy, I am a sucker for it. Melancholy is probably one of the hardest tones to pull off in a movie, but when it hits it, I'm always there for it. And that's what this movie is. It ultimately builds your heart up and breaks it, and builds it up and breaks it over and over and over again, and eventually just makes you feel stronger for it. And yet, when you finish the film, you don't feel overjoyed, but you do feel melancholy. It's that sort of like in between sadness and happiness feeling. And that's what this entire story brings throughout. It made me smile and cry alternatively over and over again. All the acting is truly fantastic. Steven Yeun, who many people may know from The Walking Dead, is ostensibly the star of this movie, but every member of the family does fantastically. The grandmother in this movie, I think, is a particular standout as well. I think she also alternatively just brings a smile to my face and also breaks my heart numerous times. So just a truly, truly standout gem that I did not expect to love as much as I did. I did not expect to even put it on this list, and yet it is my number 2. All right, now, before we get to my number 1 movie of the year, I did promise all of you that I would tell you what my least favorite movie this year was. And no, it is not actually Artemis Fowl, or Wonder Woman 1984 for that matter. Both those movies are bad. Artemis Fowl, distinctly worse than Wonder Woman 1984. I thought it was sort of like, despite my major problems with it, and I did a whole video on that, it's very middling. No, the award for worst movie, the Gendy for worst movie of 2020 for me, Jesse Gender, was Scoob. I hated Scoob. Never before have I seen a movie that was just so disdainful of what it was. This was not a Scooby-Doo movie. I was so looking forward to this because I love Scooby-Doo. The original live-action Scooby-Doo movie is honestly, it's a bad movie, but I honestly really love it for so many different reasons. It has a unique place in my life for weirdly teaching me what sex was. That's a different story. I did a video on that as well. But I love Scooby-Doo, and I love the old cartoons. I had a VHS tape of Scooby-Doo that I watched over and over and over again whenever I was stuck at my grandparents' house. So I love Scooby-Doo, and I think Scooby-Doo is one of my favorite things ever. Pup Named Scooby-Doo is a great animated show that I really love too. So I was actually really looking forward to this movie and really looking forward to seeing a big screen return for Scooby-Doo. And this movie just has no interest in being a Scooby-Doo movie. This movie is essentially a giant trailer for some Hanna-Barbera cinematic universe that they were trying to build that I don't think anyone asked for or wanted. I'm not saying that we couldn't have had a Hanna-Barbera cinematic universe. I think that might have worked if it had been built naturally, but it just goes to, that sort of studio thinking of like, we want to move too fast, and so we're going to shove in a bunch of trailers for all these other movies that we want to make over the next few years that we're never going to make because you need to make an actual good movie first before you can make these other ones. They just do not get how the Marvel model of cinematic universes work. And so this movie just has like a bunch of references to Hanna-Barbera stuff. The villain of the movie is a Hanna-Barbera villain that had nothing to do with Scooby-Doo. And then it also tries to be a superhero movie on top of that and try to ape the Marvel movie thing despite it being a Scooby-Doo movie. It splits up the Scooby Gang initially, like very quickly, so we don't get the sense of like them actually solving a mystery. There is no mystery to solve in any case, so that doesn't really matter. Yeah, this movie just was such a corporate bungled mess that just had clear disdain for even wanting to be a Scooby-Doo movie that it just angered me. There's even a Simon Cowell appearance. How, like, weirdly things like, oh yeah, the kids, they're gonna love Simon Cowell for some reason, doing his, like, American Idol impression from, like, 10 years ago. It's just clear that this movie was made by studio executives, for studio executives, and it just angered me, because it was a movie that I was really looking forward to. All right, now that I've vented my frustration out on Scoob, and I'm sure some people like Scoob, and that is totally okay. You know my channel. I'm not going to, hate on you for liking something that I disliked. Scoob just particularly angered me. But let's get to my number 1 film of the year, because my number 1 film of the year is Palm Springs. So many people have already talked about Palm Springs, but I will throw my 2 cents in this movie. This is a unique take on the Groundhog's Day formula, and I think it does so. There have been a lot of like sort of time loop Groundhog's Day movies done over the past few years and sort of different twists on them. Happy Death Day 2 You, I think are 2 particularly great examples. We also had Russian Doll, I think did it really well. Live, Die, Repeat, or I don't even remember what the actual title of that movie is, but those are all really wonderful takes. But for my money, I think this might be one of my favorites or my personal bests of those. I think it's a truly heartwarming movie that has so many surprising twists to it and yet ultimately feels so affirming. It also, what I really love about movies like this is that when they take their concept and actually treat it with real weight despite the comedy. Like Andy Samberg makes the joke about the multiverse, like, oh, that like maybe there's a multiverse thing going on here. And I just like when movies like reference the like weird concepts that we think about when we think about like, you know, movies like time loop storylines. And yet it also tells, like I said, a very human story, and one about, you know, overcoming our past mistakes and trying to be better people. And yet does it in such a fun kind of way, in such an honest way, that I just, this movie spoke to me and I adored it. Also, the fact that Superman himself, Tyler Hoechlin, was in this movie made me smile, because I've loved Tyler Hoechlin since his Teen Wolf days, and so I just like seeing him in things. So the Tyler Hoechlin bump is what I'll call that for this movie. So yeah, Palm Springs was my number one movie of the year, and one that I cannot recommend enough. That is my top 20 of the year, as well as my least favorite movie of the year. Like I said, it's ostensibly ranked, but I'm sure I would change up the order at some points in some ways depending on what mood I'm in, so don't take that too seriously. But what were your favorite movies of this year? I'd love to hear all that down in the comments below. Let me know your top movies of 2020. And thank you so much for watching this video. It's already gone on too long, so I'll bid you all adieu. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to help me out on Patreon if you want to help make this channel even better, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Thank you so much to all of my patrons who are helping me achieve my dream of doing this full time, and especially a thank you to Catherine Lambeth, Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen Bokikio, Eli Bergmoss, Ashlyn Solstice, Michael D., Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Chamomile T., Ulysses the Pagan, Randy Thompson, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Stefan Schuhart, Wayne Twitchell, Roar, Ish the Mad, Dominic Noble, Buttoneer, John Steele, Michael Beam, Jedi Indiana Jones, William Stewart, Gavin Robinson, Nathan Olson, BBD, Amanda Ronye Adanya, The Suspense, Jason Knott, Hannah F., Andrew Jorgensen, Maeve, Jasmine, Skylar Gray, Sean Piper, Andrew K., Bree Beecher, Subraxis, Jane Packard and Chloe Dollar, Nathan Steele, Tiffany Danger, Mari Neckar, Wendizzle Bizzle, Bush, W. Randy Eady, Mark the Edge, Piston Twisted Garage, Geek Filter, Gretchen Badger, Polly Mina, Jean Mithune, Sarah Bystam, Lysa, Din, Jacob Tovar, Celestial Dawn, Lily, Andrew Lamoureux, Raina C., Zone 1 Librarian, Michael Hardy, Corey Honkanen, and Vale Dunn. Thank you. You are all beautiful, beautiful people.